linked to opioids are skyrocketing. Senseless deaths have rocked our communities. It's a serious matter needing serious dialogue. Your voice, your future. Opioid epidemic. A roundtable discussion starts now.
Good evening, I'm Rick Schutt.
And I'm Suzanne Spencer. Welcome tonight to our Town Hall Roundtable on the opioid epidemic facing our community. It's no secret that this problem is growing.
Now tonight we have a panel of experts who will talk about the challenges facing law enforcement, the evolving profile of the drugs, and providing treatment for those abusing it.
This isn't just a problem that we're talking about. We are living it every day in our community. Someone overdoses here in St. Joseph County. People are dying, and there's a lot of work to do.
Every one of those cases I remember.
The Savage brothers from Granger died from drug overdoses in 2015.
They've saved a lot of people's lives with this.
It's a case Commander Dave Wells of St. Joseph County's Drug Investigative Unit hasn't forgotten.
The worst part of this job is having to tell a loved one that their 22-year-old son or brother or daughter is dead because they were using drugs.
The Savage brothers case is far too common. In St. Joseph County alone, one person overdoses every day. On average, 1 out of those 7 die each week.
South Bend really is a hub for the drug world.
Positioned between Chicago, Detroit, and Indianapolis, South Bend is a crossroads for the drug industry, and medics are left to deal with those calls.
With these new drugs that come out, you know, the users are basically playing Russian roulette every time they're using. They don't know what the consistency or the makeup of these drugs are.
Not just South Bend, but neighboring LaPorte County feels that pressure too.
It crosses all barriers. It doesn't know anybody that's friends. It doesn't care about whether you're wealthy. It doesn't care if you live in the city or which side of the railroad tracks you live on.
Until treatment gets better, Wells says it will continue to remain a problem.
Until we have that, this problem will not go away. It will always be here.
Those faces and those stories are why we're here tonight, to start the conversation and to bring about change.
So let's begin tonight's discussion. Here to moderate things for us is Mark Hyman from our parent company, Sinclair Broadcasting. Mark?
More than 52,000 people died nationwide from drug overdoses in 2015. More than 1,200 in Indiana, more than 1,700 in Michigan. Drug ODs are now the leading cause of injury death in America, more than motor vehicle and firearms-related causes. And half of those come from heroin or prescription painkillers. Good evening, I'm Mark Hyman, host of Behind the Headlines. Thank you at home for joining us. The opioid epidemic. Tonight, we talk about it. Now, when it comes to overdosing, there are no age, race, gender, or income boundaries. Drug ODs is the most indiscriminate killer. This is indeed a public health emergency. Now, we've got questions we're going to put to our fantastic panel of experts, but you at home can also join us in this discussion. A question we ask live on air may be yours. Soon we'll be checking in with news anchor Suzanne Spencer, who's manning our social media desk. But we have a lot to talk about right now. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and meet our panel. Joining us this evening is Mickey Ashpole. He is the Director of Outreach of Water's Edge Recovery. Dave Wells. He is a commander of the St. Joseph County Drug Investigation Unit. John Horsley, he is the Director of Addiction Services at Oak Lawn. And Mike Bohacek, he is a Senator of District 8. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. We have a lot to talk about. Let's go ahead and get started. Commander, I want to start with you. For many of us, we thought heroin was a drug from the 70s and the 80s that was totally wiped out of existence. And yet it's made this horrific comeback. Why is that?
So the heroin that was being used back in the 70s and 80s is not the heroin that is being used today. It is much more potent, much more powerful. It is being cut with synthetic opioids, used with prescription drugs as well, and other opioids, synthetics like fentanyl and carfentanil, and it is killing people.
Mickey, you have some personal experience with this, and certainly for those people who are my age and older, we look at this and remember the days of bent spoons and Bunsen burners and hypodermic needles, and for those who are using just heroin, that's not even the way people ingest it today. It's easier. People who are afraid of needles can take heroin, can't they?
Yes, absolutely, and it's starting a lot younger. You know, it's starting in high schools. And it's, for myself and a lot of people, it starts with simple prescriptions from your doctors, from your dentists, from your orthopedic surgeons. That's really how it starts. And when you take that first pill, you never think, it's not a conscious thought that someday I'm going to end up injecting heroin. It's not even a conscious thought.
Addiction, Mr. Horsley. It's a problem because it's not necessarily a choice. Is that correct?
That's correct. We have clear brain research that indicates that the whole brain gets completely rewired when a person light switch goes off and develops a substance use disorder, rewired in ways that causes the brain and the body to crave whatever substance. And with opioids and heroin now, it's affecting the brain in ways that we never even knew before. In fact, it can take a heroin user up to 2 years for their brain to heal to the point where they can just tolerate, manage, and not feel cravings for the drugs. That's a lot longer than what we used to think, which was 6 months to a year.
Senator, last year there was a Pennsylvania county district attorney who decided that going forward he was going to rule all overdose deaths as homicides. What are your thoughts about that?
You know, we had some legislation that came forward in committee hearing that would have charged a buddy addict with a homicide in the event that the person that they're using with dies during the course of using the drugs. I had a real problem with it because, in my opinion, that was just going to ensure that people wouldn't call for help if their friend was struggling. So we wanted to make sure that that was not a piece of legislation that moved forward, and I think it was a good decision.
Let's explore that a little more. Let's discuss that struggle, because there seems to be two schools of thought. Certainly last year in Florida was the first time that somebody at the federal level was convicted of providing fentanyl that was involved in the fatal overdose of a young man. And so there's one school of thought that says we want to hold these people who are enablers, who are complicit, accountable. Another school of thought says we want to provide a safe haven for these people who actually come forward and say, save my friend. We did some bad things, but let's save his life today. Talk about that conflict.
Yeah, you make a great point, because what we have to do is we have to make sure that the person that we're going to charge is the right person, and that our legislation that's written is charging the right person. Is a, you know, an enabling a friend that they're you know, utilizing drugs with, is that the right person to charge? I would probably say no. I would think that we need to look at the upstream supply chain, you know, the actual higher level dealers, and let's pursue those opportunities better. And let's draft legislation that addresses that. You know, as we've spoke before, we're not going to incarcerate our way out of this by incarcerating and punishing low-level dealers and users. It's just not going to be the way that's going to you know, disrupt the supply chain that needs to happen.
Mr. Ashpaul, you addressed this a few moments ago, and I just want to follow up on something you had said. Some of our viewers sitting at home are going to say, look, these people brought it upon themselves. Why should I worry about someone who's a recreational user and an addict? But that's not the entire problem, is it? It's not recreational users. You mentioned people who perhaps taking medication become addicted.
Yeah, and if you're just looking at somebody, you can't just look at somebody and say, like, well, that person's an addict or that person's a junkie, because, I mean, looking at me now, you know, you probably can't tell that, you know, I was intravenously using heroin and cocaine and many other things about 2.5 years ago. So, and going back to what you were saying about we're not going to incarcerate ourselves out of this problem, I think it's very important. And, you know, I've been working with law enforcement to try to help them get these people that, because I agree, the dealers need to be arrested and locked up, and the users, they need treatment. You know, we need to get to the root cause of this problem. We need to address that.
Let's follow up on what you just said a moment ago. Talk to us about the Police-Assisted Recovery Initiative. You know something about that.
Yeah, it's a program that started in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I don't know, maybe if I said that wrong, Gloucester, but Gloucester, yep. And there's a reactive and a proactive way, and a reactive way is where anybody can walk into a police station and say, here's my drugs, paraphernalia, and instead of arresting them, they'll destroy the contraband, and they'll instead pair them up with an angel and get them to a treatment center. So that usually takes some time, and it takes a lot of rewriting of standard operating procedures. So, you know, in the meantime, I've been working with Undercover Narcotics, helping them and train them on, you know, because they're not trained on if somebody, you know, needs help. They're not trained on like, well, this is where you can go, this is insurance, this is level of care, this is what you need to do. They're not really trained on that, so I've kind of been helping them out with that as well.
Mr. Horsley, I want to follow up with you, and then I want to check in with Suzanne to find out what she's hearing from our viewers at home. And what Mr. Ashpo was just mentioning, it's about an individual taking initiative. But oftentimes, people aren't working by themselves. They have friends,
That's right.
families, and loved ones. A mother of a 23-year-old son who died from a heroin overdose told me, you cannot love your child out of addiction. Please explain to our parents at home who are watching this right now why just being a loving parent is not enough to get their child out of an addiction.
Well, it's an overwhelming brain disease and disorder, and you know, especially with heroin and opiates, the outcomes from people who are professionals and have years of experience with this are moderate to modest, to say the least. And so what I've noticed is a lot of parents have difficulty wrapping their mind around that my kid is having this addiction problem. And partly because they've maybe never experienced it themselves, or they don't know people, and they've had very good lives and very functional and been great parents. But the truth of the matter is that it's not enough to ignore it and write it off as typical teenage behavior. It's not enough to not take them and get an assessment and get them checked out. It's not enough to say, you know, kids will be kids. You got to be proactive in dealing with this right away. The quicker a parent responds, the better the outcome.
We're about 10 minutes into our program. We've already asked and answered a number of questions here, but our viewers have been weighing in on this issue for several days now. Suzanne Spencer's been in the newsroom, and she's in there right now. She's been following what our viewers at home have to say about all this. Suzanne, what do you have for us?
Mark, social media is obviously a huge component of getting viewers in on this issue. We want you all at home to join the conversation with the hashtag #YourVoiceYourFuture. Also adding comments on our Facebook page. Our live stream is fully up right now with a live stream of what's going on right there in the studio, and also our Twitter page so that we can keep up to date and ask your questions to our panel of guests this evening. Just got a comment in on Facebook that says you guys are giving some good info and people need it and bad. Another person also commenting that this is an important issue that is really raising a lot of attention in the community. I'm also, though, seeing a lot of comments about the role doctors play in this epidemic. I want to show you a comment from Facebook. Her name is Deborah. She says, why are we not making the doctors who overprescribe these drugs the first line of defense in using it? Now, another Facebook commenter, Leslie, reiterates some of those same thoughts, calling doctors' prescription writing, quote, legalized drug dealing. She says doctors prescribe pills like candy. There needs to be an emphasis on real health and wellness, not just writing a prescription and creating a new user. Now, on the flip side, as you know, lots of people weighing in on Facebook. Kathy says her doctor tests her every 3 months to ensure that she's not overtaking the pills or selling them, and she says that she trusts her doctor. Obviously, though, these commenters on Facebook raise a very important issue, Mark. I think, how do doctors play a role in solving this epidemic?
Great stuff, Suzanne. And Commander, I'd like to bring you back in the conversation. Now, of course, there are a handful of bad doctors out there. Last year in Alabama, a pair of doctors were arrested for running a pill mill. They'd written over 273,000 prescriptions in a 4.5-year period, which worked out to about 30 prescriptions an hour. Now, that's a pretty small number of people, doctors, who are engaged in that behavior. We want to broaden and talk about just the good old doctor down the street who we see on a regular basis who are writing prescriptions for painkillers. Let's talk about how that can be a contributor to this problem.
Sure. What we're seeing, though, as this epidemic explodes across the country is that more and more doctors are actually becoming more aware of the dangers of overprescribing to their patients. So we're actually in contact with a lot of the local resident doctors here. We meet with them and we discuss these issues, and in hopes of trying to bring those overprescriptions for opiates down for their patients. And I think you're starting to see that across the country. I know that it's becoming more plausible here in St. Joe County that docs aren't overprescribing so much anymore because they see what a epidemic this has become.
And Senator, I'm going to put you on the spot for one as far as the role of the legislature. According to the Centers for Disease Control, they've looked at all the states in terms of how many prescriptions for painkillers are written per every 100 people on an annual basis. Indiana is above the national average. Nationally, 82 prescriptions are written for every 100 people. Indiana, it's 109. And just for some context, Alabama leads the nation with 143. Hawaii is at the bottom with 52. So if we want to move those prescription painkiller numbers down, what role does the state legislature have?
We actually passed 2 laws this year, Senate Enroll Act 151, which requires inspect, and inspect addresses the issue you just spoke about, which is doctor shopping, where I go to see you, I get a prescription, and then I go see another physician with the same ailment or claiming the same ailment, and then I can start stacking up my prescriptions. Senate Enrolled Act 151 addressed that. Additionally, Senate Enrolled Act 226 addresses another issue too, is that the first contact with the doctor for an injury or whatever the case may be, you may only need just a few days of pain relief, but what ends up happening is people hang on to those drugs for a very long period of time. They end up staying in a medicine cabinet, and it opens it up for abuse. So now your first contact with a doctor in the event of an injury or something that requires pain mitigation is a 7-day supply before you can get a more long-term solution. And the goal with that is to keep those drugs from piling up in people's medicine cabinets, where young people have the opportunity to experiment and to see what it's all about. And I think this is going to help as well. So,
Mr. Horst, I want to follow up on what the senator just said. What are some of the things for our parents who are watching right now, parents, any loved one, a spouse, a boyfriend, girlfriend, what are the signs they should look for if they think there's someone in their house who potentially is an addict? Now, certainly the issue of unexpired meds in the medicine cabinet certainly creates a problem, but what are the signs they should look for?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about prevention, making sure that we're not leaving those meds in our medicine cabinets. But big signs would be drastic changes in behavior, poor school performance, dropping out of things, nodding off. It's a big one for opiates. And what I mean by nodding off is, they just kind of go out into space. Sometimes they'll have complaints of stomach issues or constipation or sweating, or maybe they'll have seizures, or maybe relatives or friends report that their narcotics are missing. These are some common signs that would definitely require a person to have their kid assessed and take a look at it. Are we having a problem here, and what do we need to do about it?
Mr. Ashpole, for those people who are watching at home, particularly older Americans who look at this and say, you know what, it's society, it's popular culture. I want to share with you something that ran on Saturday Night Live a year ago. They ran a parody ad for a fake product called Heroin AM, and the parody included, heroin use in America is steadily on the rise, but productivity among heroin users remains stagnant. That's why Heroin AM combines heroin with 5 milligrams of caffeine and a small pile of cocaine. And now available in gummy bears. Is popular culture contributing to this, or is it just simply an excuse? If popular culture wasn't making fun of drug abuse, would we still have these problems, or are they a contributor?
I think that reducing the stigma and spreading awareness is definitely going to help with that, and almost normalizing it. Because if you talk to your middle to upper class family, it's not something you want to talk about. At dinner time. Well, my kids, you're at your house party, and well, my kid won't clean up his room, he won't do his chores, and then the other parent, and I've had this happen, with parents that I've seen, they just want to scream, well, my kid's on heroin, but they can't because there's a stigma attached to it. And going back to what you were saying about the doctors, real quick, there's some practical things that, doctors can do. They can do some pre-screening questions to ask them. And something that, I do, and this is a true story, when I went to my dentist, I moved from Florida to Indiana, and I went to my dentist, and they say, are you allergic to any medicines? I said, yes, I'm allergic to narcotic medicines. And they said, well, what happens to you? Do you break out in hives? Do you break out in rash? And I said, no, I break out in handcuffs. We all got a good laugh about it, But it's, just putting it out there that, hey, and there is some responsibility on the addict, or potential addict to say, if you have that predisposition, why not just say, you know what, hey, I probably shouldn't have this. And I've also seen, you know, where doctors, they don't treat the addiction, they treat the symptoms, but, you know, there's some practical things you can do. And another thing to look at, you know, with your family members or friends or children or whatever loved ones that may be addicted is the pupils. The pupils get very, very small when they're on opiates, and there is a lot of sweating and itching that you were talking about, and the mood changes. Those are all things that you can look forward to.
Commander, I want to follow up on something that Mr. Ashball just said, and it was a small but a very significant point. He talked about the dinner table. And in your line of work, whether it's drug addiction or any other kind of misbehavior, just having the family sitting down together at least once a day, because we lead such busy lives, but having everyone together and having those open and honest discussions and for parents being able to look their children in the eye is pretty important. Can you talk about that?
Sure. We go around and we try and talk to as many people as we can. If they will have us, we will speak. What I tell parents and grandparents is don't be naive that your kids aren't experimenting with these drugs. Leaving a bottle of Oxycontin in your medicine cabinet is just like leaving a loaded gun laying on the kitchen table. It's that dangerous. I've seen kids that actually break down the drugs or split them in half or crush them up. What you do is you alter the medicine time release, and they're either going to parties and snorting that or smoking it, and they're overdosing. So it's very important to have these conversations with your children. We have them with assemblies of kids all the time, the dangers of these drugs, and their parents and grandparents, to make sure that, you know, grandma got her hip replaced and has a bottle of something she doesn't take anymore. You need to get rid of it. Get it out of the house, do a pill drop, get rid of it. That's where the at-home education needs to be focused on.
And Commander, a quick follow-up with you, and then I want to check back in with Suzanne. Last year, Walgreens announced that it was going to make naloxone available without a prescription in 200 stores throughout the Hoosier state. Why is that important?
Well, what we're seeing is that a lot of addicts are actually picking up Narcan and sort of doing the buddy-buddy system, just like scuba divers will. You have a buddy, you never go diving by yourself. Some of the cultural changes is we're not going to get high by ourselves. Of course, that doesn't always apply. There's also an importance for family members who know that they have a heroin addict in their family, and they want to keep a dose of Narcan on hand in case they find their loved one passed out and overdosing. So that's an important aspect of having a Narcan available to the general public.
Yeah, comment on
Please.
Locally, there's a great resource called Guido's Purple Shamrocks, and they do naloxone training and give out free kits. Everybody should have a Narcan kit because this is so pervasive. I have Narcan kits on my desk at the office. We use them for people in overdose. You had said something just a second ago where you classified substance abuse as misbehavior, and I know it was small, but I think that's where we have to have a mind shift. It's not misbehavior, it's not character, it's not moral, it's a medical condition that we need to treat, and we don't need to look at that like we look at juvenile vandalism. We need to look at it as the same way we would cancer, diabetes, and other chronic diseases, so we can get people and kids the right kind of treatment.
Point well taken. Let's check in with our social media desk. Suzanne, still in the newsroom. Suzanne, what have you learned?
Mark, we are seeing lots of traction on our Facebook Live page right now. Lots of you commenting your questions and also just your experiences with addiction and drugs in general. I want to talk you through a couple of different points I'm seeing on social media. One of those is the importance of family that you all talked about, sitting around the table and having that discussion. One of the points from Jamie says this is extremely important. It's not just the suffering addict, but also the family dynamic. It's a family disease. Also talking about how this impacts not just adults, but also kids. We're hearing from Terry on Facebook, who's saying it's not all ages. It's all ages, not just kids. And also from Joe, again, really narrowing down that point that this is a very real issue. Joe is telling us that what should you do if your 18-year-old is using and refuses to quit? Again, reiterating how important this issue is. I want to throw it back to you guys in the studio. Again, lots of different points, especially narrowing in on that family dynamic and how families really can use that in moving the conversation forward with their young ones in this situation.
Thank you, Suzanne. And Mr. Horsley made a great comment. I want to bring you back in the conversation, Senator, and put you in kind of the hot seat here, because this is probably the problem that's not easy to solve. Societal views. If someone developed cancer, the neighborhood pulls together, they start a Facebook page, they have a GoFundMe account, people bring over potluck meals to get them through it. If someone has an addict in the family, they get shunned, they get ignored. Do we need to change society's attitudes?
Yeah, we absolutely do. And we have to look at the root cause of what caused somebody to become an addict. People just don't jump to heroin from nothing. It's not a gateway situation. So this was a slow process. It's a slow process to enter. It's going to be a slow process to get folks off of it. But and it takes the family and it takes the community to help people. We can look at many different treatment options, and we can look at many different opportunities to detox folks, and we can talk about all the drugs. But at the end of the day, if we don't provide them the wraparound services that they need in the community, and it is a community-wide effort, because if we don't provide the wraparound services, they're going to go right back to their old behaviors, because that's where they're comfortable. You're moving someone from a place of comfort to a new place that's foreign to them. And it's going to take the community, and that's a community as a whole, to be able to make that happen and to be successful.
And we're going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time. Our nation has waged a war on drug for decades, whether it's prescription pharmaceuticals, narcotics produced in a makeshift lab, or exotic plants grown here or abroad. Anytime people get caught up with these addictions, it creates problems for themselves, their families, an entire community. We hope we've had some discussion here tonight that's answered some of the questions you may have. We're continuing discussion on our Facebook page at facebook.com/WSBT News. Make certain you watch our late news, as we have a special report on this particular issue, as well as coverage of this roundtable and all the day's breaking news. I'd like to thank our panel for joining us. I'd like to thank you at home for being a part of this. I'd like to thank the wonderful crew of WSBT News. In closing, we'd like to salute our military, law enforcement, firefighters, EMTs, and other emergency personnel for their service to our communities and our nation. I'm Mark Hyman. Good night.